Empezaré yo con una pregunta, pregunta que ha sido trasladada al anterior ponente, al señor Fontana, y es acerca del futuro que ofrece un mercado como es el africano.
The African market. It's interesting. Clearly, there are at least two halves to Africa. The Northern Africa region, where things are really built on the wealth of oil and gas there. So the market does tend to go up and down with the oil price. But fundamentally, they're kind of quite rich economies. The political stability is obviously a question. We saw that in the Arab Spring. But they have the money, and there is a certain willingness to invest. So they're interesting markets, and there's generally good growth there, but they're difficult politically. Sub-Saharan Africa, as my illustration showed, is a very small market, but many of the countries there have had many years of consistent growth. So it's getting to a point where they're interesting. Having said that, it's clearly an area where there is very strong interest from the Chinese government and the state-owned contractors, which arguably are just an extension of the Chinese government. And what you're seeing very clearly is a sort of economic imperialism, if you like, where the Chinese government are buying things like mineral rights and buying agricultural land and putting in the rail links and the infrastructure you need. So there is kind of quite good construction growth in China, but much of it is essentially tied to aid or, basically tied to the Chinese government. I think the area that is interesting is that a lot of the broader public infrastructure projects in Africa are funded by the multilateral lenders like the World Bank and the African Development Bank, and there's also a certain amount of direct aid from rich governments. So I think they're the projects that are probably the most interesting. They're procured in a more sensible way these days, so it's not just the cheapest bid that wins necessarily. And I think that's probably where the opportunities lie with the multilateral development lending.
Another question, Chris. Do you think that it's possible to see the same kind of massive growth that compact equipment sees in the emerging markets, namely backhoe loaders, in the rest of the broader portfolio of construction equipment?
In any market, or?
There is no...
In emerging markets. I think it's possible. I mean, you kind of have to remember that the countries that are in the very early stages of development generally have extremely small construction equipment markets because there are populations that are there and available and are very, very cheap labor. In fact, with one of the problems in a lot of emerging markets is that construction projects are seen as something that can employ a lot of people. So there's actually a very strong emphasis on manual labor, whereas a more mechanized approach would get them built quicker. Clearly that is something that changes over time as people's earning power goes up, as their skills improve, and there is a move away from manual labor to more mechanization. So the general answer to the question is yes. Clearly there are some countries out there with very big populations that have potential for very, very big construction equipment markets. But, I may well be retired when they actually come to fruition.
Voy a continuar con preguntas, ya que veo que no os animáis. Me voy a centrar en mercados de los que todos hablamos, en especial de dos mercados, el mercado chino y el mercado brasileño. Estamos escuchando que el mercado chino últimamente pues está bajando de forma importante la venta de maquinaria de construcción. A futuro, ¿qué perspectivas ves, Chris?
I think the Chinese market long-term has potential. You're talking about a population of maybe 1.5 billion people, and if you look at the sales of construction equipment per capita, it's a long way behind what you see in developed markets. So clearly there's potential for growth long term, and I think that will happen. The problem that you have in China right now is that there was a downturn, for the last 2 years after the big bubble of stimulus. And really none of the companies in China, especially the domestic producers, really knew what a recession was, really knew how to deal with it. So the factories kept turning out machines even though there weren't customers for them. Many of the domestic producers are owned by the state or the local government, so there's pressure on them to keep people employed, to keep making machines. So you still had machines flooding onto the market with no one really willing to buy them. They were going out on extremely dubious commercial terms. And, I think it would be naive to think that there's clearly a lot of bad debt in the system. And how that will shake out, I don't know. It may be that the Chinese government finds a way of underwriting it and taking it off the books. But there is potential for some of the big players to collapse, and many of them have built up a lot of debt over the years. And frankly, in China, you never have to. The idea of fraud and corruption is never really far away. So I think China has more shaking out to do. I think long term the prospects are good, but I don't think it is really kind of dealt with its boom and its bust of the last couple of years.
Y para finalizar, ¿qué va a pasar en Brasil después de los mundiales, después de que España gane a Inglaterra en la gran final? ¿Qué perspectivas ves?
Sorry, there's something wrong with the translation there about Spain winning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when Wayne Rooney lifts the World Cup, it'll be a happy moment all over the world. The Latin America is interesting because there's more to Latin America than just Brazil, and there's more to Brazil than just the World Cup and the Olympics. There's huge investment in infrastructure linked to the oil and gas wealth. And there's a strong climate of investment across Latin America in general. How long that can be sustained with infrastructure spending growing at 7% per year and GDP only growing at 3-4% per year is an interesting one. And it's possible that projects would stall, but on the whole, the infrastructure investment I think is there for the long term beyond the forthcoming sporting events in Brazil. So I'm broadly optimistic on Latin America. I think it's a very promising long-term market, but clearly it's a region that's not without its troubles, and there's a very clear need for reform in many parts of the public sector.
Muchas gracias, Chris.